I'm just here testing out the new Formula Renault 2.0 at Spa. I haven't had a particularly huge amount of time with it, but I just thought I'd give my first impressions for people who are considering switching over to it from the Star Mazda for this season. In many ways it's quite a similar car, but in many ways it's also quite a very different car. First thing to look at would be the power. This was much debated in the pre-season testing when people were talking about the car. Is it going to feel as fast as the Star Mazda, because it does have less horsepower? And in a straight line, I can say no, it doesn't. You can definitely feel the decrease in acceleration. However, once the car's up to speed, you don't notice it so much. It's just on the initial acceleration from the pits and that it does feel like it's taken a bit more time. Don't get me wrong, it's not significantly slow or anything, but it does feel like maybe a slight step down from the Star Mazda in outright power and speed. The second thing, which I think is a major change, and I think this is a huge change for the better, is the gearbox. Gone is the 6-speed Star Mazda gearbox with its very hesitant downshifts and its tendency to unsettle the car when you were downshifting into a corner. And we've got a nice new 7-speed gearbox here. It downshifts much quicker and it's smooth. You don't unsettle the car trying to downshift it into the mid corner, which I think is a pretty significant benefit. The extra gear ratios definitely help the car feel quicker too, because it's got shorter gearing. So in terms of acceleration, especially when you're up to speed, it's really not that noticeably different. Maybe if you hop from one car to another, you might feel it, but after I've been driving this for a while, I kind of forget that I'm not driving the Star Mazda in terms of acceleration, to be honest. The next thing would be the steering. It is different to the Star Mazda. The Star Mazda had very light, almost arcadey steering. This is heavier, not hugely heavy, but slightly heavier, and I think it has more lock to the wheel, as in you have to turn the wheel more to get the car to pitch. Now that may be just because we haven't got the setups going yet. I suspect when the better setups start to be released and people put the car more on the nose, the amount of steering effort will probably reduce with that. But I have had quite a bit of play with the setups, and I'm still by no means mastering how to do them yet. Although the options are very similar to the Star Mazda, it's a completely different experience to know how to set this up to be quick. And that was an example back then of just not being used to the downshifts. You have to take more downshifts in this car than you do in the Star Mazda, and you just don't do it by feel. Like, you have to concentrate. But of course that'll come to you when you get used to the car. Next key performance element would be braking. And in terms of stopping power, it feels very similar to the Star Mazda. If anything, brakes to me feel a bit more forgiving, as in I can put a lot of brake pressure in and they don't feel like they're constantly locking. Whereas the Star Mazda was constantly like on a real knife edge between brake pressure and locking, which you got used to over time and you adapted the brake balance to. But I think anyone would definitely find this easier to just pick up and not be making lots of errors with the brakes. I'm just starting to get a good feel of the downforce. I think it may have even a little bit more peak downforce, particularly at high speeds. It really grabs into the corner quite well. The one downside of the braking that I have noticed is there is no in-car brake balance adjuster, which in my view is a pretty big thing for iRacing to leave out. Like, you press F8 and nothing comes up. I hope that they implement that by week 1, because I know that a lot of the faster guys are shifting brake balances on the fly between the corners. I don't personally do it. I tend to find something I'm comfortable with and just adapt my driving style to it, but you kind of need to. And also, if you don't have an in-car adjustment for the brake balance, if you make an error with the brake balance, which does change due to weather and small setup, like if you change the wing level slightly and you haven't quite got it in, you're then stuck with that for the entire race, which I don't think is going to be realistic on the on any junior Formula series like this. Got down enough gears then. You can feel it on initial throttle application that you can be a lot harder on the throttle than the Star Mazda without worrying about spinning the rear wheels up. The car feels more settled as a whole, at least in the more conservative settings. I have tried to put it on its nose a little bit more, and with disastrous consequences so far, but I'm sure we'll get there just with a bit more time. I've only had 1 to 2 hours driving in this car. The other thing that's quite different in it is the visibility. As you can see, we're sitting quite low in the cockpit, and you can see a lot of the nose that we're maybe not used to. Looked weird to start with. I forgot about it within a couple of minutes. It's not something I don't think. I saw some people were wanting to change it. It's not something that personally worries me, but you can change your seating position. What worries you? See, through there I was very aggressive on the throttle and the back end stuck. I don't think the Star Mazda you could quite that aggressive. So in that regard, it has maybe become slightly easier to extract the limit. But once again, I think that'll change once people get used to the setups. This is only a very early setup with a few things changed from the baseline to make it drivable. One thing I am having to adapt to quite a bit is the amount of wheel inputs I'm used to. In this Star Mazda, you can basically drive it by your fingertips. You're barely moving the wheel. In this, in a lot of the sharper corners, you are having to load quite a lot of wheel lock in, which can be a bit disconcerting when you're not used to it. But again, it's something that we'll get used to as the season goes on, I suspect. Yeah, in terms of how the car is to drive, it's the closest thing you'll get in RS in the Star Mazda. I've never been a huge fan of the skip Barbara. I found it just has no grip in any corner. The car just understeer, the front end slides. In this, the front end's very direct. The back end's well stuck. I'm still getting confused with the gearing there. It's got plenty of downforce that you can really throw it into the corners. You don't feel like you're constantly fighting a front end that's not moving. It's responsive in this configuration, so I'm sure once we get the setups done properly, it'll be even better. And yeah, I'd say overall it's quite a fun car to drive, and particularly around a track like Spa. Spa's a really good suited track for this car. It's because of the extra grip and stability. You can really use the curvings that you couldn't on the Star Mazda. I noticed it in a quick test at Watkins Glen, that if you were getting up on the curvings, even there, like I'll do it again, just to... It just doesn't unsettle it as much. At Watkins Glen, at the bus stop, if you were getting up on the curvings in the Star Mazda, you were in for a bad time, put it like that. You're usually getting launched up in the wall. In this, you can just ride up on the curvings like they're nothing. It doesn't particularly throw the car around either, so that is an area that's that I think is improved in the car. Not that you always want the car to be easier, forever easier to drive, but it's just got a bit more stability. And I think it's more realistic to be able to take the curvings without the car just launching off the track. Most race car drivers do drive their car on the curbs. The other big difference, of course, is the setup. Now, I have spent some time buggering around with it. The options are similar to the Star Mazda. If anything, there's slightly less options. A lot of the damping options are gone. They only give you really basic damping control. The other stuff's there, of course, the basic wing levels and that. A lot of the more delicate wing level options are there. There's only one option for the front and the rear wing, and of course you can go in and adjust the camber and the toe and everything on the car. The big change is probably the diff options, which I'm still working. Change like diff locking force, things like that, which will alter how the car behaves both on throttle and off throttle. Like you can make it oversteer off throttle or oversteer on throttle, for instance. I'm still not quite sure how to get the most out of those tools just yet. And the downforce balance in this car is back to probably more what you'd expect. Like in the last season of Star Mazda, I was running 59% forward downforce balance at most tracks, the A59%, and that was producing competitive lap times. In this, from what I've seen, it's in the low 40s, so that's probably a more realistic balance, unlike the Star Mazda, which people were just basically running minimum rear wing every single racetrack and putting on the front wing. Next, fun. I think the car's fun. It seems like a well-designed, stable race car to me. I personally myself was kind of more interested in something a little bit quicker than the Star Mazda, and this isn't that. This is comparable to the Star Mazda. I think that in most tracks it'll actually be slightly slower, like you'll see maybe 1 second per lap time delta, but in terms of driving, you don't really feel that. It feels drastically quicker than the Skippy. Same sort of downforce as the Star Mazda. That's basically the same braking point line I take you there in the Star Mazda, and it sticks quite well. And how quick will the Star Mazda drivers get used to this car? I think there is a bit of a learning curve, definitely. The main learning curve is how to set it up. I'm no engineer and have no engineering understanding, but I did know how to set the Star Mazda up quite well just by looking at the options, feeling the car and changing a few settings. And last season's Star Mazda had a huge set convergence issue in that everyone was basically running the same set. Like maybe some of the absolute fastest guys were running the car with a lot more frontal downforce and less rear downforce, so it was very unstable. But in terms of damping, ARB, ride heights and that, it was pretty similar from a track to track, and all you were really doing is adjusting the wing and maybe brake balance to get a decent setup. In this whole new ball game, a lot of options we're not particularly familiar with, and a car we're not particularly familiar with. So I think that if you're coming from the Star Mazda, this is, from my opinion, is one of the guys who ran at the front of the Star Mazda. It is going to be a fair learning curve to get back up to speed in this car. It's different enough that just your innate feelings of what is the limit, especially for the front end, just don't carry over. So I think a lot of the guys who were maybe towards the front of the Star Mazda are going to find that they're not instantly at the front in this car, and they're going to have to work for it. But that's fun. That's the good of a new car. That's the challenge. I've run the Star Mazda for years, so I didn't really enjoy that many of the other cars. Like I tried the GT3 cars, liked them, but didn't really love them. So this will give a good performance boost. And I think that in terms of participation, looking at the pre-week, how many people are running it in week 13, it's going to be a very popular car. So there's going to be a huge range of driver talents running it, and every race is going to probably multiple split for at least season 1 until people decide they like it. I don't really see any of the major problems in this as a reason to stay in the Star Mazda. Like, change, particularly in a car you're very comfortable with, can be hard. But there's nothing about this car that stands out about it that says to me, geez, I want to run back to the Star Mazda. Like, especially around Spa, it feels very similar. Very similar to what I'm used to driving. I'm not running particularly consistent laps because I'm trying to talk and drive at the same time, but before I was running pretty much on my optimal every lap, and that shows that if nothing else, I'm consistent in it. If I'm fast in it, remains to be seen. But anyway, that was my first look at the Formula Renault. I'll be giving it a run. I'll be running it, and I think it will become my main car this season. Slightly slower than the Star Mazda, slightly different to drive than the Star Mazda, but more or less the same experience as what you've got used to in the Star Mazda. If you're looking for a accessible open wheel car to drive, I think it's the clear choice of the current racing lineup.